Do you want even more free audiobooks? Start listening now. Sign up for your 3-book, 30-day free trial from audiobooks.com. Click the link in the video description and get your 3 audiobooks free today. There's no strings attached, and you can cancel anytime. Click the link in the video description and sign up now.
Book 5, Part 1 of The Art of War by Niccolo Machiavelli, translated by Henry Neville. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 5, Part 1. Fabrizio said, "I have shown you how to organize an army to battle another army which is seen posted against you, and I have told you how it is overcome, and also of the many circumstances which can occur because of the various incidents surrounding it, so that it appears to me now to be the time to show you how to organize an army against an enemy which is unseen, but which you are continually afraid will assault you. This happens when marching through country which is hostile, or suspected of being so. And first you have to understand that a Roman army ordinarily always sent ahead some groups of cavalry as observers for the march. Afterwards the right wing followed. After this came all the wagons which pertained to it. After those another legion, and next its wagons. After these come the left wing with its wagons in the rear, and the remainder of the cavalry followed in the last part. This was in effect the manner in which one ordinarily marched. And if it happened that the army should be assaulted on the march in front or from the rear, they quickly caused all the wagons to be withdrawn either on the right or on the left, according as it happened, or rather as best they could, depending on the location, and all the forces together, free from their baggage, set up a front on that side from which the enemy was coming. If they were assaulted on the flank, they would withdraw the wagons to the side which was secure, and set up a front on the other. This method, being good and prudently conducted, appears to me ought to be imitated, sending cavalry ahead to observe the country, then having 4 battalions, having the march in line, and each with its wagons in the rear. And as the wagons are of 2 kinds, that is, those pertaining to individual soldiers, and the public ones for use by the whole camp, I would divide the public wagons into 4 parts, and assign a part to each battalion, also dividing the artillery and all the unarmed men, so that each one of those armed should have its equal share of the impedimenta. But as it sometimes happens that one marches in a country not only suspect, but hostile in fact, that you are afraid of being attacked hourly, in order to go more securely, you are compelled to change the formation of the march, and go on in the regular way, so that in some unforeseen place neither the inhabitants nor the army can injure you. In such a case, the ancient captains usually went on with the army in squares, for such they called these formations, not because it was entirely square, but because it was capable of fighting on 4 sides, and they said they were going prepared either for marching or for battle. I do not want to stray far from this method, and want to arrange my 2 battalions, which I have taken as a rule for an army, in this manner. If you want, therefore, to walk securely through the enemy country, and be able to respond from every side, if you had been assaulted by surprise and wanting in accordance with the ancients to bring it into a square, I would plan to make a square whose hollow was 200 arm lengths on every side, in this manner. I would first place the flanks, each distant from the other by 212 arm lengths, and would place 5 companies in each flank, in a file along its length, and distant from each other 3 arm lengths. These would occupy their own space, each company occupying a space 40 arm lengths by 212 arm lengths. Between the front and rear of these 2 flanks, I would place another 10 companies, 5 on each side, arranging them in such a way that 4 should be next to the front of the right flank, and 5 at the rear of the left flank, leaving between each one an interval or gap of 4 arm lengths, one of which should be next to the front of the left flank, and one at the rear of the right flank. and as the space existing between the one flank and the other is 212 arm lengths, and these companies placed alongside each other by their width and not length, they would come to occupy, with the intervals, 134 arm lengths, and there would be between the 4 companies placed on the front of the right flank and one placed on the left, a remaining space of 78 arm lengths, and a similar space be left among the companies placed in the rear parts. And there would be no other difference, except that one space would be on the rear side towards the right wing, the other would be on the front side towards the left wing. In the space of 78 arm lengths, in front I would place all the ordinary veleti, and that in the rear the extraordinary veleti, who would come to be 1,000 per space. And if you want that the space taken up by the army should be 212 arm lengths on every side, I would see that 5 companies are placed in front, and those that are placed in the rear should not occupy any space already occupied by the flanks, and therefore I would see that the 5 companies in the rear should have their front touch the rear of their flanks, and those in the front should have their rear touch the front of their flanks, so that on every side of the army space would remain to receive another company. And as there are 4 spaces, I would take 4 banners away from the extraordinary pikemen, and would put one on every corner. And the 2 banners of the aforementioned pikemen left to me I would place in the middle of the hollow of their army, formed in a square of companies, at the heads of which the general captain would remain with his men around him. And as these companies so arranged all march in one direction, but not all fight in one, in putting them together one has to arrange which sides are not guarded by other companies during the battle. And therefore it ought to be considered that the 5 companies in front protect all the other sides except the front, and therefore these have to be assembled in an orderly manner, and with the pikemen in front. The 5 companies behind protect all the sides except the side in the back, and therefore ought to be assembled so that the pikemen are in the rear, as we will demonstrate in its place. The 5 companies on the right flank protect all the sides from the right flank outward. The 5 on the left engird all the sides from the left flank outward, and therefore in arranging the companies the pikemen ought to be placed so that they turn by that flank which is uncovered. And as the heads of 10 are placed in the front and rear, so that when they have to fight all the army and its members are in their proper places, the manner of accomplishing this was told when we discussed the methods of arranging the companies. I would divide the artillery, and one part I would place outside the right flank, and the other at the left. I would send the light cavalry ahead to reconnoitre the country. Of the men-at-arms I would place part in the rear on the right wing, and part on the left, distant 40 arm lengths from the companies. And no matter how you arrange your army, you have to take up as the cavalry this general rule, that you have to place them always either in the rear or on the flanks. Whoever places them ahead in front of the army must do one of 2 things. Either he places them so far ahead that if they are repulsed they have so much room to give them time to be able to obtain shelter for themselves from your infantry and not collide with them, or to range them, the infantry, with so many intervals that by means of them the cavalry can enter among them without disorganizing them. Let not anyone think little of this instruction, because many, not being aware of this, have been ruined and have been disorganized and routed by themselves. The wagons and the unarmed men are placed in the plaza that exists within the army, and so compartmented that they easily make way for whoever wants to go from one side to the other, or from one front of the army to the other. These companies, without artillery and cavalry, occupy 280 arm lengths of space on the outside in every direction, and as this square is composed of 2 battalions, it must be devised as to which part one battalion makes up, and which part the other. And since the battalions are called by number, and each of them has, as you know, 10 companies and a general head, I would have the 1st battalion place its first 5 companies in the front, and the other 5 on the left flank, and the head should be in the left angle of the front. The first 5 companies of the 2nd battalion then should be placed on the right flank, and the other 5 in the rear, and the head should be in the right angle, who would undertake the office of tergitatore. The army, organized in this manner, is ready to move, and in its movement should completely observe this arrangement, and without doubt it is secure from all the tumults of the inhabitants. Nor ought the captain make other provisions against these tumultuous assaults than sometimes to give a commission to some cavalry or band of veliti to put them in their place. Nor will it ever happen that these tumultuous people will come to meet you with the drawing of sword or pike, because disorderly people are afraid of order. And it will always be seen that they make a great assault with shouts and noises without otherwise approaching you, in the way of yelping dogs around a mastiff. Hannibal, when he came to harm from the Romans in Italy, passed through all of France, and always took little account of the tumults of the French. When you want to march, you must have levellers and men with pickaxes ahead, who clear the road for you, and who are well protected by that cavalry sent ahead to reconnoitre. An army will march in this order 10 miles a day, and enough sun and light will remain for them to dine and camp, since ordinarily an army marches 20 miles. If it happens that it is assaulted by an organized army, this assault cannot arise suddenly, because an organized army travels at its own rate, so that you are always in time to reorganize for the engagement, and quickly bring yourself to that formation, or similar to that formation, of the army which I showed you above. For if you are assaulted on the front side, you do nothing except to have the artillery in the flanks and the cavalry behind come forward and take those places and with those distances mentioned above. The 1,000 veliti who are forward come forth from their positions, and dividing into groups of 100, enter into their places between the cavalry and the wings of the army. Then, into the voids left by them, enter the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen, which I had placed in the plaza of the army. The 1,000 veliti that I had placed in the rear depart from there and distribute themselves among the flanks of the companies to strengthen them, and from the open space they leave, all the wagons and unarmed men issue forth and place themselves in the rear of the companies. The plaza, therefore, remains vacant, as everyone has gone to their places, and the 5 companies that I placed in the rear of the army come forward through the open void that exists between the one and the other flank, and march toward the company in the front, and the 3 approach them at 40 arm lengths, with equal intervals between one another, and 2 remain behind, distant another 40 arm lengths. This formation can be organized quickly, and comes to be almost the same as the first disposition of the army which we described before. And if it becomes more straitened at the front, it becomes larger in the flanks, which does not weaken it. But as the 5 companies in the back have their pikemen in the rear for the reasons mentioned above, it is necessary to have them come from the forward part, if you want them to get behind the front of the army. And therefore one must either make them turn company by company as a solid body, or make them enter quickly between the ranks of the shield-bearers or swordsmen, and bring them forward, which method is more swift and less disorderly than to make them turn. And thus you ought to do with all those who are in the rear in every kind of assault, as I will show you. If it should happen that the enemy comes from the rear, the first thing that ought to be done is to have everyone turn to face the enemy, so that at once the front of the army becomes the rear, and the rear the front. Then all those methods of organizing the front should be followed, which I mentioned above. If the enemy attacks on the right flank, the entire army ought to be made to face in that direction, and then those things ought to be done to strengthen that new front which were mentioned above, so that the cavalry, the veliti, and the artillery are in the position assigned in this front. There is only this difference, that in the changing of fronts, of those who move about, some have to go further and some less. It is indeed true that when a front is made on the right flank, the veliti would have to enter the intervals or gaps that exist between the wings of the army, and the cavalry would be those nearer to the left flank, in the position of those who would have to enter into the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen placed in the centre. But before they enter, the wagons and unarmed men stationed at the openings should clear the plaza and retire behind the left flank, which then becomes the rear of the army. And the other veliti, who should be placed in the rear according to the original arrangement, in this case should not be changed, as that place should not remain open, which from being the rear would become a flank. All the other things ought to be done as was said concerning the first front. What has been said concerning making a front from the right flank is intended also in making one from the left flank, since the same arrangements ought to be observed. If the enemy should happen to be large and organized to assault you on two sides, the two sides on which he assaults you ought to be strengthened from the two that are not assaulted, doubling the ranks in each one, and distributing the artillery, veliti, and cavalry among each side. If he comes from 3 or 4 sides, it needs must be either you or he lacks prudence. For if you were wise, you would never put yourself on the side where the enemy could assault you from 3 or 4 sides with large and organized forces. And if he wanted to attack you in safety, he must be so large and assault you on each side with a force almost as large as you have in your entire army. And if you are so little prudent that you put yourself in the midst of the territory and forces of an enemy who has 3 times the organized forces that you have, you cannot complain if evil happens to you, except of yourself. If it happens not by your fault, but by some misadventure, the injury will be without shame, and it will happen to you as it did to the Scipios in Spain and the Hasdrubal in Italy. But if the enemy has a much larger force than you, and in order to disorganize you wants to assault you on several sides, it will be his foolishness and his gamble. For to do this he must spread himself thin, that you can always attack on one side and resist on another, and in a brief time ruin him. This method of organizing an army, which is not seen but who is feared, is necessary, and it is a most useful thing to accustom your soldiers to assemble and march in such order, and in marching arrange themselves to fight according to the first front planned, and then return to marching formation. From that make a front from the rear, and then from the flank, and from that return to the original formation. These exercises and accustomization are necessary matters if you want a disciplined and trained army. Captains and princes have to work hard at these things, nor is military discipline anything else than to know how to command and how to execute these things. Nor is a disciplined army anything else than an army which is well trained in these arrangements. Nor would it be possible for anyone in these times who should well employ such discipline ever to be routed. And if this square formation which I have described is somewhat difficult, such difficulty is necessary if you take it up as an exercise, since, knowing how to organize and maintain oneself well in this, one would afterwards know how to manage more easily those which will not be as difficult. End of Book 5, Part 1. Book 5, Part 2 of The Art of War by Niccolo Machiavelli. Translated by Henry Neville. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 5, Part 2. Zenobi said, "I believe, as you say, that these arrangements are very necessary, and by myself I would not know what to add or leave out. It is true that I desire to know 2 things from you. The one, when you want to make a front from the rear or from a flank, and you want them to turn, whether the command is given by voice or by sound or bugle call. The other, whether those you sent ahead to clear the roads in order to make a path for the army ought to be soldiers of your companies, or other lowly people assigned to such practices." Fabrizio said, "Your first question is very important, for often the commands of the captain, not very well understood or poorly interpreted, have disorganized their army. Hence the voices with which they command in times of danger ought to be loud and clear. And if you command with sounds or bugle calls, it ought to be done so that they are so different from each other that one cannot be mistaken for another. And if you command by voice, you ought to be alert to avoid general words, and use particular ones. And of the particular ones, avoid those which might be able to be interpreted in an incorrect manner. Many times saying, "Go back, go back," has caused an army to be ruined. Therefore this expression ought to be avoided, and in its place use retreat. If you want them to turn so as to change the front, either from the rear or from the flank, never use turn around, but say to the left, to the right, to the rear, to the front. So, too, all the other words have to be simple and clear, as hurry, hold still, forward, return. And all those things which can be done by words are done. The others are done by sounds or calls. As to the road clearers, which is your second question, I would have this job done by my own soldiers, as much because the ancient military did so, as also because there would be fewer unarmed men and less impediments in the army. And I would draw the number needed from every company, and I would have them take up the tools suitable for clearing, and leave their arms in those ranks that are closest to them, which would carry them so that if the enemy should come, they would have nothing to do but take them up again and return to their ranks. Zenobi said, "Who would carry the clearing equipment?" Fabrizio said, "The wagons assigned to carry such equipment." Zenobi said, "I'm afraid you have never led these soldiers of ours to dig." Fabrizio said, "Everything will be discussed in its place. For now I want to leave these parts alone, and discuss the manner of living of the army. For it appears to me that, having worked them so hard, it is time to refresh and restore them with food. You have to understand that a prince ought to organize his army as expeditiously as possible, and take away from it all those things that add burdens to it, and make the enterprise difficult. Among those that cause more difficulty are to have to keep the army provided with wine and baked bread. The ancients did not think of wine, for lacking it they drank water tinted with a little vinegar, and not wine. They did not cook bread in ovens, as is customary throughout the cities, but they provided flour, and every soldier satisfied himself of that in his own way, having lard and grease for condiment, which gave flavour to the bread they made, and which kept them strong. So that the provisions of eating for the army were flour, vinegar, bacon and lard, and barley for the horses. Ordinarily they had herds of large and small beasts that followed the army, which, as they did not need to be carried, did not impede them much. This arrangement permitted an ancient army to march sometimes for many days through solitary and difficult places without suffering hardship for lack of provisions, for it lived from things which could be drawn behind. The contrary happens in modern armies, which, as they do not want to lack wine and eat baked bread in the manner of those at home do, and of which they cannot make provision for long, often are hungry. Or, even if they are provided, it is done with hardship and at very great expense. I would, therefore, return an army to this form of living, and I would not have them eat other bread than that which they cook for themselves. As to wine, I would not prohibit its drinking, or that it should come into the army, but I would not use either industry or hard work to obtain it, and as to other provisions, I would govern myself entirely as the ancients. If you would consider this matter well, you will see how much difficulty is removed, and how many troubles and hardships an army and a captain avoid, and what great advantage it will give any enterprise which you want to undertake." Zenobi said, "We have overcome the enemy in the field, and then marched on his country. Reason wants that there be no booty, ransoming of towns, prisoners taken. Yet I would like to know how the ancients governed themselves in these matters." Fabrizio said, "Here I will satisfy you. I believe you have considered, since I have at another time discussed this with some of you, that modern wars impoverish as much those lords who win as those who lose. For if one loses the state, the other loses his money and movable possessions, which anciently did not happen, as the winner of a war then was enriched. This arises from not keeping track in these times of the booty acquired, as was done anciently, but everything is left to the direction of the soldiers. This method makes for two very great disorders. The one, that of which I have spoken, The other, that a soldier becomes more desirous of booty and less an observer of orders. And it has often been said that the cupidity for booty has made him lose who has been victorious. The Romans, however, who were princes in this matter, provided for both these inconveniences, ordering that all the booty belonged to the public, and that hence the public should dispense it as it pleased. And so they had quaestors in the army, who were, as we would say, chamberlains, to whom all the ransoms and booty was given to hold. From which the consul served himself to give the soldiers their regular pay, to help the wounded and infirm, and to provide for the other needs of the army. The consul could indeed, and often did, concede a booty to the soldiers, but this concession did not cause disorders. For when the enemy army was routed, all the booty was placed in the middle, and was distributed to each person according to the merits of each. This method made for the soldiers attending to winning and not robbing, and the Roman legions defeating the enemy but not pursuing him, for they never departed from their orders. Only the cavalry and lightly armed men pursued him, unless there were other soldiers than legionaries, which, if the booty would have been kept by whoever required it, it was neither possible nor reasonable to expect to hold the legion firm, and would bring on many dangers. From this it resulted, therefore, that the public was enriched, and every consul brought, with his triumphs, much treasure into the treasury, which constituted entirely of ransoms and booty. Another thing well considered by the ancients was the pay they gave to each soldier. They wanted a third part to be placed next to him who carried the flag of the company, who never was given any except that furnished by the war. They did this for two reasons. The first, so that the soldier would make capital and save some of his pay. For the greater part of them being young and irresponsible, the more they had, the more they spent without need to. The other part because, knowing that their movable possessions were next to the flag, they would be forced to have greater care and defend it with greater obstinacy, and thus this method made them savers and strong. All of these things are necessary to observe if you want to bring the military up to your standards. Zenobie said, "I believe it is not possible for an army, while marching from place to place, not to encounter dangerous incidents, and where the industry of the captain and the virtue of the soldier is needed if they are to be avoided. Therefore, if you should have something that occurs to you, I would take care to listen." Fabrizio said, "I will willingly content you, especially as it is necessary if I want to give you complete knowledge of the practice. The captains, while they march with the army, ought above everything else to guard against ambushes, which may happen in two ways. Either you enter into them while marching, or the enemy cunningly draws you into them without your being aware of it. In the first case, if you want to avoid them, it is necessary to send ahead double the guard, who reconnoitre the country. And the more the country is suitable for ambush, as are wooded and mountainous countries, the more diligence ought to be used, for the enemy always place themselves either in woods or behind a hill. And just as by not foreseeing an ambush you will be ruined, so by foreseeing it you will not be harmed. Birds or dust have often discovered the enemy, for where the enemy comes to meet you he will always raise a great dust, which will point out his coming to you. Thus often a captain, when he sees in a place whence he ought to pass pigeons taking off, and other birds flying about freely, circling and not settling, has recognized this to be the place of an enemy ambush, and knowing this, has sent his forces forward, saving himself and injuring the enemy. As to the second case, being drawn into it, which our men call being drawn into a trap, you ought to look out not to believe readily those things that appear to be less reasonable than they should be, as would be the case if an enemy places some booty before you. You would believe it to be an act of love, but would conceal deceit inside it. If many enemies are driven out by few of your men, if only a few of the enemy assault you, if the enemy takes to sudden and unreasonable flight, in such cases you ought always to be afraid of deceit. And you should never believe that the enemy does not know his business. Rather, if you want to deceive yourself less, and bring on less danger, The more he appears weak, the more the enemy appears more cautious, so much the more ought you to be wary of him. And in this you have to use two different means, since you have to fear him with your thoughts and arrangements, but by words and other external demonstrations show him how much you disparage him. For this latter method causes your soldiers to have more hope in obtaining the victory. The former makes you more cautious and less apt to be deceived. And you have to understand that when you march through enemy country, you face more and greater dangers than in undertaking an engagement. And therefore, when marching, a captain ought to double his diligence, and the first thing he ought to do is to have all the country through which he marches described and depicted, so that he will know the places, the numbers, the distances, the roads, the mountains, the rivers, the marshes, and all their characteristics. And in getting to know this, in divers ways, one must have around him different people who know the places, and question them with diligence, and contrast their information, and make notes according as it checks out. He ought to send cavalry ahead, and with them prudent heads, not so much to discover the enemy as to reconnoitre the country, to see whether it checks with the places, and with the information received from them. He ought also to send out guides, guarded and kept loyal by hopes of reward and fear of punishment. And above all, he ought to see to it that the army does not know to which sides he guides them, since there is nothing more useful in war than to keep silent about the things that have to be done. And so that a sudden assault does not disturb your soldiers, you ought to advise them to be prepared with their arms, since things that are foreseen cause less harm. Many have, in order to avoid the confusion of the march, placed the wagons and the unarmed men under the banners, and commanded them to follow them, so that, having to stop or retire during the march, they are able to do so more easily, which I approve very much as something useful. He ought also to have an awareness during the march that one part of the army does not detach itself from another, or that, one part going faster and the other more slowly, the army does not become compacted, which things cause disorganization. It is necessary, therefore, to place the heads along the sides, who should maintain the steps uniform, restraining those who are too fast, and hastening the slow, which step cannot be better regulated than by sound. The roads ought to be widened, so that at least one company can always move in order. The customs and characteristics of the enemy ought to be considered, and if he wants to assault you in the morning, noon, or night, and if he is more powerful in infantry or cavalry, from what you have learned you may organize and prepare yourself. But let us come to some incident in particular. It sometimes happens that, as you are taking yourself away from in front of the enemy, because you judge yourself to be inferior to him, and therefore do not want to come to an engagement with him, he comes upon your rear as you arrive at the banks of a river, which causes you to lose time in its crossing, so that the enemy is about to join up and combat with you. There have been some who have found themselves in such peril, their army girded on the rear side by a ditch, and filling it with tow, have set it afire. Then they have passed on with the army without being able to be impeded by the enemy, he being stopped by that fire which was in between. Zenobi said, "And it is hard for me to believe that this fire can check him, especially as I remember to have heard that Hanno the Carthaginian, when he was besieged by the enemy, girded himself on that side from which he wanted to make an eruption with wood, and set fire to it, whence the enemy, not being intent to guard that side, had his army pass over the flames, having each soldier protect his face from the fire and smoke with his shield." Fabrizio said, "You say well, but consider what I have said, and what Hanno did. For I said that he dug a ditch and filled it with tow, so that whoever wanted to pass had to contend with the ditch and the fire. Hanno made the fire without a ditch, and, as he wanted to pass through it, did not make it very large or strong, since it would have impeded him even without the ditch. Do you not know that Nabonidus the Spartan, when he was besieged in Sparta by the Romans, set fire to part of his own town in order to stop the passage of the Romans, who had already entered inside, and by those flames not only stopped their passage, but pushed them out. But let us return to our subject. Quintus Lutatius, the Roman, having the Cimbri at his rear, and arriving at a river, so that the enemy should give him time to cross, made as if to give him time to combat him, and therefore feigned to make camp there, and had ditches dug, and some pavilions raised, and sent some horses to the camps to be shod, so that the Cimbri, believing he was encamping, they also encamped, and divided themselves into several parts to provide themselves with food, of which Lutatius, becoming aware, he crossed the river without being able to be impeded by them. Some, in order to cross a river, not having a bridge, have diverted it, and having drawn a part of it in their rear, the other then became so low that they crossed it easily. If the rivers are rapid, and desiring that the infantry should cross more safely, the more capable horses are placed on the side above which holds back the water, and another part below which succour the infantry, if any, in crossing, should be overcome by the river. Rivers that are not forded are crossed by bridges, boats, and rafts, and it is therefore well to have skills in your armies capable of doing all these things. It sometimes happens that in crossing a river the enemy on the opposite bank impedes you. If you want to overcome this difficulty, there is no better example than that of Caesar, who, having his army on the bank of a river in Gaul, and his crossing being impeded by Vercingetorix the Gaul, who had his forces on the other side of the river, marched for several days along the river, and the enemy did the same. And Caesar, having made an encampment in a woody place, and suitable to conceal his forces, withdrew 3 cohorts from every legion, and had them stop in that place, commanding then that as soon as he should depart, they should throw a bridge across and fortify it, and he with the rest of his forces continued the march. Whence Vercingetorix, seeing the number of legions, and believing that no part had remained behind, also continued the march. But Caesar, as soon as he thought the bridge had been completed, turned back, and finding everything in order, crossed the river without difficulty. Zenobi said, "Do you have any rule for recognizing the fords?" Fabrizio said, "Yes, we have. The river, in that part between the stagnant water and the current, always looks like a line to whoever looks at it, is shallower, and is a place more suitable for fording than elsewhere, for the river always places more material, and in a pack, which it draws with it from the bottom, which thing, as it has been experienced many times, is very true." Zenobi said, "If it happens that the river has washed away the bottom of the ford, so that horses sink, what remedy do you have?" Fabrizio said, "Make grids of wood, and place them on the bottom of the river, and cross over those. But let us pursue our discussion. If it happens that a captain with his army is caught between 2 mountains, and has but 2 ways of saving himself, either that in front or the one in the rear, and both being occupied by the enemy, has as a remedy to do what some have done in the past, which is to dig a large ditch difficult to cross, and show the enemy that by it you want to be able to hold him with all his forces, without having to fear those forces in the rear, for which the road in front remains open. The enemy, believing this, fortifies himself on the side open, and abandons the side closed, which he then throws a wooden bridge, planned for such a result, over the ditch, and without any impediment passes on that side, and freed himself from the hands of the enemy. Lucius Minutius, the Roman consul, was in Liguria with the armies, and had been enclosed between certain mountains by the enemy, from which he could not go out. He therefore sent some soldiers of Numidia, whom he had in his army, who were badly armed and mounted on small and scrawny horses, towards those places which were guarded by the enemy, and the first sight of whom caused the enemy to assemble to defend the pass. But when they saw those forces poorly organized, and also poorly mounted, they esteemed them little, and loosed their guard. As soon as the Numidians saw this, giving spurs to their horses and attacking them, they passed by without the enemy being able to take any remedy. And having passed, they wasted and plundered the country, constraining the enemy to leave the pass free to the army of Lucius. Some captain who has found himself assaulted by a great multitude of the enemy has tightened his ranks and given the enemy the faculty of completely surrounding him, and then has applied force to that part which he has recognized as being weaker, and has made a path in that way, and saved himself. Marcantonio, while retiring before the army of the Parthians, became aware that every day at daybreak, as he moved, the enemy assaulted him, and infested him throughout the march, so that he took the course of not departing before midday, so that the Parthians, believing he should not want to decamp that day, returned to their quarters, and Marcantonio was able then for the remainder of the day to march without being molested. This same man, to escape the darts of the Parthians, commanded that when the Parthians came towards them, they should kneel, and the second rank of the company should place their shields on the heads of those in the first, the third on those of the second, the fourth on the third, and so on successively, so that the entire army came to be as under a roof, and protected from the darts of the enemy. This is as much as occurs to me to tell of what can happen to an army when marching. Therefore, if nothing else occurs to you, we'll pass on to another part. End of Book 5.